Hello, everyone. It is great to see such a great turnout for this session, and welcome all to the Pari Center's online summer series, exploring the life and work of David Bohm. I'm James Barbieri. I'm a member of the board of directors here at the Pari Center, and I will be your host today. Today with me, we also have Eleanor Peat, who is the program director of the Pari Center, and Maureen Doolan, who is the co-founder of the Pari Center. They will basically be behind the scenes, ensuring that everything runs smoothly. Before we begin, I'd just like to remind everyone of a couple of Zoom rules for this session. During the presentations, we ask participants to turn off their microphone just to ensure a better audio quality. For this reason, we may mute you if we can hear any background noise, but this is not to silence any participant's voice. It's just to ensure the quality of the audio. If a participant does want to ask questions, they are welcome to by either using the raise your hand function on Zoom or just physically raising their hands. And if we spot you, then you can turn on your microphone. We also invite participants to turn on their video camera, as we believe that seeing everyone's faces creates it's a nice inclusive educational environment. However, if you don't feel comfortable doing that, you are free to just keep it off. I would also like to, explain a bit of the chat section here on Zoom, as we will be using it for this session. On your screen, you will see a little chat icon. And if you press it, the chat box should appear. If you haven't found it, I'll just send a message so that everyone, so basically you see it as a notification. Just bear with me. Here. A notification should have popped up, and that is basically, there's a chat box, send a message, and you should be able to talk to all the participants. Also would like to remind everyone that these sessions are recorded for archival purposes. The recordings will not include the possible breakout rooms, discussion, or this informal meet and greet that we've just had. But they will include the speakers' presentations, the follow-up discussions, and Q&A. These recordings are available to all of you, anyone who has purchased a ticket, or if someone has got paid for a session but were unable to attend. Today's session will be a bit different from the others as it's a bit more interactive, but I'll leave it to Beth to explain how it's going to go. And now I'll just introduce our speaker. Today it is a great pleasure to welcome Beth Macy here at the Pari Center. Beth has been a friend of David Peat and has certainly become a friend of ours and of the center. The common threads weaving through Beth's career has been change. She's been a manager, leader, consultant, or participant in organizations and that basically are expecting difficult issues. David Bohm's dialogue has been core to her research in her writing, in her consulting and teaching for nearly 3 decades. She is completing a book on the ideas and individuals who influenced Bohm's process of dialogue. So I extend a very warm welcome to Beth, and over to you.
Thank you. And as I'm looking at the screen and just thinking that there are people here from all sorts of places in my life, and those who are friends from a long time back, people who are new friends, people who are friends to come. If I didn't get to say hello to you when you came on, I just want to say I'm really glad you're here with me. And this is something new I'm going to share with you. I've not shared this with anybody yet. I've been working on it for a long time. In fact, David Peat helped me start working on this, and that's 7, 8, 9 years ago that it's kind of been in brewing with me. But if any of you are writers, you know how different your rough draft is from what you publish. You're getting rough draft today. So I say that with a bit of nervousness because it still is pretty rough. And as I thought about whether I wanted to share it, I thought, well, what better group than people who have really enjoyed David Bohm's life and work, as well as dialogue. So I share it with you with that sense of tenuousness. And I look forward to your comments, and be gentle. It's still, I'm still feeling a bit vulnerable with what I'm going to share with you. Now, what I'm going to share is going to be probably different than what you thought, because the questions that I wanted to address had to do with how dialogue tends to be so powerful. And I've had multiple experiences with dialogue where it just seems to go under the surface so far and get really underneath our normal way of thinking. And I've always just been really, really curious how that happens. And then secondly, I still have a lot of questions about where it came from in David Bohm's life. So what was it about David Bohm that would make him want to give up the last, I don't mean give up entirely, but devote so much of his effort to dialogue when he was this eminent theoretical physicist? So those are kind of my questions. And I'm going to delve into it in a different way than probably you expected, which I'll share with you in a moment. But one of the things that I've really noticed in doing this is that, I think it was Basil who was talking about how David Bohm was a little bit compartmentalized in how he shared some of his experience and his background and his interests with some people and not with others. And so I really think what I'm going to share with you today is something that he probably didn't share quite so openly. And so it might be new or different to some of you. The other thing I would say is, that I've tried to go back and put my presentation here as much as I possibly can in David Bohm's words. So I'm trying not to rely on interpretations that may have been made. So I'm going to try as much as I can to go back to his work. Now I'm going to put this on screen share, but I just want you to know my computer's a little bit slow, so if it takes just a moment, don't panic that I've lost things here. Just another moment. Aha. Okay, can you see the screen okay? Does it come out? Yeah, great. Okay, so I've called this Tracing the Stories of David Bohm in Dialogue. And the reason I did that was because I want to tell you lots of stories today, stories that I've been able to pick up from a lot of different places about David Bohm's thinking and life and how that comes out in the process of dialogue. So maybe if my computer will cooperate. It's being very slow here. Sorry, there we go. Okay, so do a little stage setting, but what I want to do is tell you stories, and I'm going to put them in a couple of categories, doing that as a way to see if we can find some patterns that emerge from David Bohm's, particularly his early life, that then start to show up later as we come to dialogue. So I'm going to do that in two chunks. We're going to talk about his early childhood. And I've got some stories, a few of these you've heard already. And then I'm thinking that probably quite a few of these you haven't yet. Then there's also his later childhood and adulthood. And after we've done that, I'm going to say, can we then start to discern pattern that was occurring in David Bohm's life? And I say yes. I really think that there's some really clear pattern that shows up. And then I'm going to say that that also then flows into his ideas about dialogue. So that's where I'm headed toward, and hope that you will agree with me. And afterwards, then we're going to have comments and questions. Now, I have to tell you that it was just really hard for me to squeeze this down to the amount of time we have today. So in truth, I haven't left as much time for questions and answers as you're used to on these sessions. I apologize for that. I just couldn't squeeze down any more than what I have. So there are a couple of places where I'll stop and ask for some input from you, however. So with that, I am going to move on. Now, I wanted to put this slide in, particularly for one of the people in the group here, Judy Feldman. She doesn't know I was going to do this. So Judy, this is referring to something you said. She and I were in a small group together in one of our earlier sessions talking about David Bohm. And she said something to this effect. No matter how much we know about David Bohm's life, there's certain things that David Bohm just seemed to have brought in with him that were just there. And so I want to validate that. When I started this project with David Peat quite some time back, we were thinking there's really 3 areas that really influence anybody's life. One is their ancestry, their inheritance, all that comes from their family background and all. There's the impact of one's own life, family and circumstances. But then there's this other one that's really difficult to hone in on because it's so speculative, it's very ethereal. But really, it takes all 3 of these, and perhaps there are even more, to really come to somebody's core personality. So today, I'm only going to be going here, but I just want to make sure that I'm giving proper value to these other areas of somebody's life. So I'm going to delve in with you right here. So how am I going to do that? Well, I want to just say a little tiny bit about patterns. This is the question that I want to pursue together with you. What are the inner life patterns and meanings that guided David Bohm's experience and that are reflected in his life work and theories, particularly in dialogue? Now, these are 2 authors that I had studied some time back, Atwood and Storlow, and this was their observation. They were studying people like Carl Jung, Sigmund Freud, others, and what they found is that if they went into those theorists' theories and really looked for the core elements of those theories, they would look back then into that person's childhood and they would find those same elements. So these theorists didn't realize it, but what they were doing was projecting things from their own early life experience that were quite deeply buried into their own personality, into their own inner self. They were projecting those things out into their theories. So I got thinking, well, if that's true of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, maybe that's true of David Bohm. Now, I'm going to do it backwards. I'm going to say, let's go into his life first and see if we can find the patterns. And then let's go forward and say, can we find that other places in his life and his science and in his dialogue? So that's kind of where we're headed. So we're going to look like this. We're going to look at his early childhood and look at his late adulthood, or late childhood and early adulthood, see what we can find. So I'm going to start here, and you saw that, those of you who saw the documentary, then you know this part of the story, so I'm going to just touch on it really briefly. So David Bohm's parents were both immigrants. His mother, Frida Popke, came from Lithuania, and the one thing I would say about her is that she appears to have had some difficulty once her family came to the United States. I think she was around 6 then. Seems like she had difficulties in that adjustment. Now, we don't really know a whole lot about that early part, but we do know that later in her life, she did have some relatively serious mental health issues, and in fact was hospitalized at times. Now, Samuel Bohm, David's father, also an immigrant, he came from Hungary. He had been sent over by families who had helped raise him because his own parents had died when he was quite young and left 9 siblings. So he had been raised by the community. They took up a collection, sent him with some coins and a list of people in the United States who are other Jewish immigrants who might be helpful to him to get settled. So our story kind of starts when Frida Popke's father, Harry, who had the responsibility in that culture of finding a suitable husband for his daughter, Frida. So she was about marriageable age and peculiar. So probably he was thinking he was going to have a bit of difficulty with that task. But here comes Samuel Bohm, who then was a peddler. And Harry, being quite clever, saw an opportunity. So what he does is he sets up an arranged marriage where Samuel would marry his daughter, Frida, and he would set them up in business. We don't know a whole lot about their early life together, but what we do know is that by the time David Bohm showed up and was a young child, these two were each other's throats constantly. So clearly it wasn't a marriage of love, and appears as though never was it a marriage of love. But let's pick up here and look at David Bohm's early relationship with his dad. So this comes some from David Peat's his biography, but we know that when Samuel Bohm came home from his shop, that the evening around the dinner table would be the time when the family dramas popped up. So David Peat says each evening when his father came home from the shop, the tension thickened. So besides taunting his wife with insults, Samuel would also direct his sarcasm towards David, his mother's favorite. Now, not only was David his mother's favorite, but his mother was David's favorite. And so it seems as though from the get-go, David Bohm seemed to be one of the scapegoats for his father's anger at the mother, but also probably some of the difficulty that goes along with being an immigrant and trying to reorganize your life in a new country. So then it gets even worse. David, when he had learned to read, would often go to the library, and he was just enchanted with the idea of the solar system, the idea that the planets were revolving around the sun. So he would go read these stories, come home excited to tell his father what he had just learned, and his father had no interest. All his father wanted to do was to get along in this new life, be practical, sell his furniture, and as David Peat says, this young David smoldered from his father's dismissive attitude toward him and his idea to go to anything beyond. Well, even later, his father's always describing Bohm's interest in science as being up in the air, of no value because it didn't help earn money or make friends. So it just appears as though young David was never able to find good foundation upon which he could build relationship with his father. It's just sad. So what about his mother? Well, actually, he was quite fond of his mother some of the time. I mean, when she was feeling relatively stable, he really quite liked his mother. So here's his description. He said, I felt my mother had the capacity to see inner meaning. It was sort of a spiritual quality of inward lookingness. I felt sort of an emotional bond to her when I was young, in the sense that I could trust her emotion. I couldn't trust what she would do, but I could trust her feeling. So there's part of her, at least, that he really enjoys and loves. But there was the other side. And again, I think that Paul in the documentary had some of this information, but much of the time she was in depression. She could be very volatile. There was a story about her actually breaking the nose of a neighbor woman with a bottle. And there's the story of family coming, the extended family coming for dinner at their house. She put the chicken in the oven without having plucked the feathers off, and also without having taken the innards out. Well, you can kind of laugh at that, but truthfully, that's displaying a lot of disorganization, disorientation that she was engaged in. And she also was quite a obsessive person, as David Bohm says, about his own well-being. And so much of that obsessive, are you okay? Is everything all right? That kind of attitude followed with him and probably made him somewhat of a hypochondriac. So with both parents, it was troublesome. And in fact, when he says he was 7 or 8, parents thought about separating. think about that. What's it like for a kid 7 or 8 years old to be caught in this kind of a separation? On one hand, his mom that he kind of likes sometimes would have would have been somewhat able to take care of the emotional side of him, but clearly not be able to take care of him physically. Or his father, who was perfectly capable of taking care of him, but didn't like him, dismissed him. What kind of a situation is it for for a young kid like that to have no positive outcome to look for? So you have to think that that must have been just a really difficult emotional situation for him. Now, not only that, but little David Bohm was a real clumsy kid, so he wasn't a good fit at home, but also he didn't seem to have the physical capacities to do what other little boys were doing, like playing baseball or other sports. So these are his words. He says, I seemed to lack coordination and I couldn't really throw a ball exactly where it should go or very far. Now, some people could make a coordinated move without even thinking about it. So in that area, I couldn't do it very well. And then in other areas, it seemed also like socially, it was really hard to see exactly what to do. So, wow. Well, I ran into some of his own descriptions of those early years, and I want to share those with you now. So these are things where he's sharing about his own childhood in his own words. So he says, people said my father was a good talker and entertaining, except at home where it was very unentertaining. He was always angry. Well, he was very angry with her, you see. She was very bad. He pictured the wife should really arrange, should be a tremendous help to the husband in society, and she was zero help. That was one of his principal complaints, that she didn't help him. Not only that he felt she didn't keep the house properly for him and didn't cook properly, he complained about that bitterly every day. They used to fight very hard. He would start to insult her, and she would fight and get angry and shout and sometimes even threaten to kill him. My father used to admit that she was very intelligent, but he hated everything else about her. And he was very disappointed in me. I didn't have any confidence in my mother's ability to take care of me. I should have had a mother I could have counted on. There was a feeling that my father was unjust to my mother, and that resulted in her being too downtrodden, too depressed to express herself or her inner sensitivities and talents within that chaotic home environment. My father was unjust to me. I was very unhappy even before I got to school with this sort of family situation I'd grown up in. I felt that the whole trouble all around, the meaninglessness of the whole situation, and all the nervous, neurotic reactions had sort of made me somewhat nervous and mixed up. I had the feeling that because I'd grown up there, I was not really healthy. There really wasn't much at all in my home life to inspire any confidence at all. My father and my mother were so involved in their hatred for each other, I often felt that I had to even seek dullness in order to avoid becoming disturbed. Sometimes I wanted to become dull in order not to get involved in all that, to become apathetic in certain ways. So, David Bohm's early childhood. Now, I need some help from you. I'd like you to help me with this next stage. I'd like for you to put something in chat. What I would like is one word, a title, One phrase, not a paragraph, just something really short that describes what you think David Bohm's sense of his early childhood experiences might have been. Now, not what you diagnose him as, but from his point of view, just a word or a phrase or a title. What do you think he would have said? And so I'm going to be quiet for just a moment. And then what I'm going to ask is, after a few moments, if James would just share some of the highlights of what you all are putting in there, just a few of the quick hits that you're coming up with. So James, just some quick hits. You don't have to go through
Yes,
every single one of them, just a few.
we have a lot. So I guess I can see that it does have a common thread. The words that sort of pop up here are solitude, sadness, unsettled. I can see despair. Someone even said lost potential or disconnected. Yeah, I think that is sort of what the common thread is. Definitely loneliness and solitude and loss of connection.
Yeah, okay. The one I had come up with the way I had done this whole part was I got all these vignettes and I just spread them out in front of me, and I tried to say, where does this take us? The word I came up here was fragmentation. It seemed like everything was just split. But interestingly enough, David Bohm gives us the title. So I want to share with you now what he said about this phase of his life. He called it the world of shadows. Now, does that just fit? And I have to tell you, I had so much trouble writing this segment up. It just hurts my soul every time I read this, that this child went through all this difficulty. It's just really tough. Oh, okay, so there's the world of shadows. That's the early life. Let's see where we go from here. So what about his later childhood, then his early adulthood? So here we are. We're going to switch to that phase of his life, but here's what I'd like you to watch for. I think this early phase really created a sense of void. There were missing things in his early life that he really needed. And so this was like a magnet that begins to call in various kinds of energy and experience. But down here, at this point, he's starting to school and he's beginning to develop a sense of his own personal agency. And so I think what we start to see in these vignettes that I'll show next are strategies by which he's trying to offset this void that had happened early on. So just watch and see what you think. Well, one of the things that stands out early on is that David Bohm was oppositional. Now, he wasn't aggressively oppositional. He didn't fight with people per se, but within his own mind, I think he was really taking stances against. Now, obviously against his father. Now, for one thing, his father wanted him to grow up to be the best furniture business owner that Wilkes-Barre had ever seen. Wow, nah, he didn't like that from the get-go. That clearly isn't where he was going to go. So here's what he says. I didn't actually come out and charge my father with doing something wrong, but I never went along with my father at all. And can't you just see little David Bohm crossing those arms and saying, no, I can't. So that's one thing. And again, this carries over. He has a real attitude about authority and freedom. So this is a little vignette that comes from his going to school, when he started school. So he says, there was such a contrast because outside, before he went to school, you could just talk to anybody whenever you wanted to and say, okay, and then you could say whatever you wanted to. And then suddenly, you couldn't say anything except when they wanted you to talk, and only the things they wanted you to say. And they could punish people. Oh, heavens. So he and his younger brother, Bobby, used to write stories about boogeymen, and they called these boogeymen the Boos. Well, the Boos were really organized, probably like the principals and the teachers and all that. But there were captains and majors and generals. And the worst of the Boos of all were the teachers. Now, the reason for that was because he thought what they really wanted was to exert their arbitrary authority. Now, those of you who've read the biography or been with him know that that kind of was an attitude. I think about him with Oppenheimer wanting him to do to study renormalization, which was the big thing then in physics. And he says, nah, I'm gonna keep working on plasma. So these are attitudes that really you see throughout his whole lifetime, was this opposition and this authority and demanding the freedom to do those things that he really thought were really of highest value. Now this one you saw before, you saw this in the documentary, so I'll just hit it real briefly. But the story is that Bohm and some of his young friends were in the mountains and they had to cross a river. So there were stones across it they could hop from. But Bohm's idea was that he would hop to the first stone, stop and figure out how to go to the next one, and then hop and go to the next one, stop. But he realized when he got to the first stone, if he stopped, he was going to fall in the water. So he just had to give himself up to the movement that was there, to the flow, and go with it without using his head to figure it out. Well, this is an incredibly important part of his whole ongoing theories, if you think about movement and flow. So what he says is that he saw in that experience what he called a previously hidden world of motion and flow. Now that goes even deeper. So I liked it, Ferd, that you were talking about early on about, and Peter, about this person who had interest in water and in all sorts of flows of water. Well, guess what? David Bohm loved anything that had circular movement, tornadoes. He liked the swirl in the bathtub, the water going down the drain. So I sadly had to take out a whole chunk about that because I had too many slides here. But here's one. So this follows along from the river experience. So he had been just fascinated with tornadoes. And then there was a huge storm that hit his little town of Wilkes-Barre. Now, it wasn't a tornado, but it was a really heavy wind, heavy enough that it picked up the roof on a nearby structure and threw it across the road. Well, that just fascinated him. So he's thinking back to his idea about of hopping across the river, and he's remembering that movement was so important then. Well, he's thinking about that, and he thought, wow, that's really interesting. There's no structure. I mean, there's no matter in the swirling. A tornado doesn't have any mass to it, but look what it does. So I picked this picture here because I think this described kind of what he was wanting to say. Here, this tornado has caused not just a form, but it's caused the reformation of the structure of this tree. Well, what he was seeing was that what he came to think of, well, first of all, he says, out of nothing would come a being that is out of nothing but movement. So movement must be the primary thing. It must be the causal thing that's out there. So he says movement was the origin of being and the giver of form. Well, take it one step further, and he says, oh, that must apply to me too. It must be that I'm being formed by this pattern of movement. Oh, well, think about a kid, 7, 8, 9, 10, something like that, having that kind of perception. But what we do see from that is that whole idea of motion flow becomes really critically important in all the theories that come out, I think, probably throughout his days. Now, here's another one of those things I call a strategy. I call it expanding the context. So think about what his life was like. He's home with his family, all this fighting and quarreling and turmoil. But then when he gets to school, even though he doesn't like the teachers and the authority, something that he must have been noticing was that when he's in that school context, he doesn't have quite the same turmoil that he has when he's home. Or when he goes to visit his school friends in their homes, they also, those families kind of liked each other. And even when he went to school friends, he noticed that there was really quite a difference between his background coming from a Jewish family and these Polish and Irish miners who were Catholic. And then there was the library. So here are all these various circumstances where he starts to notice not everything is all mucked up like it is at home. Well, what we can see coming out of this is his strategy of really stretching boundaries in a way that gives some dissipation to that difficulty and turmoil at home. Now, this is something we see in his life. Again, something that shows up for forever. Think about on the documentary. I just love this, Paul. This one piece where Roger Penrose is talking about his conversations with David Bohm, and he said Bohm's mind is like a wave function, that he would start out with a really clear focus, dive way deep into it, and then he would add more and more and more and more until the whole context was way out there. Well, in my mind, this was a strategy that was really valuable, not only from his childhood standpoint, but think about all the ways he reached out and really spread out the context. Look at his relationship with Krishnamurti. Look at his continual stretching his ideas by spending time and reading other authors. Think about his work with his correspondence with the artist Charles Biederman. So throughout his lifetime, he's doing the same wave function with his mind, or he's spreading things out entirely. And quite often, what we'll see is that many of those spreadings begin with a point in his life where something's making him quite unhappy. So this pattern became very, very valuable. Now, it's in contrast to this next one, which is his attitude to figure it out. Now, that's kind of like his initial idea of how he was going to cross the river. He was going to stop at each stone and figure it out. But what he does say is that early on, it came apparent to him that he could use his mind to try to make himself feel like he had more control and that he could then feel more secure. So that this is kind of in contrast, but I think it's really valuable because I think what he did was he started going really deep. I mean, you think about by the time he was 10, he was reading science magazines in the library. This, I think, is really the initiation of his deep analytical capacity. And then I put all sorts of little things on here so I don't forget to say them to you. But you think about this first strategy of expanding the context goes here, it gets broader and broader. But then this one, the figuring out, goes incredibly deep. And so between these two, I think this is part of what Basil Hiley was describing, the ineffable kind of genius that this man had. But part of it comes from these two childhood strategies that he had used to try to make himself feel more secure. I love this one. This is really an unusual one. He calls it his fingers of light dream. So here's what he says. I once had a dream where I had the notion of millions of little rays of light, which were reaching out like fingers. They weren't exactly fingers, they were rays, but they were functioning like fingers, millions of laser pencils, millions of them, feeling out my brain, probing, subtly contacting everything that they reached. And then, even more interestingly, all the information that these little fingers were finding by their probing, they took some back someplace. There was a source that they went back to. So they were probing, but finding something and returning it to a source. Very interesting. And this is going to come back in just a few moments. Now, I think you also heard the story of the skylark of space, but I want to point out a couple things about that story. One thing that's quite interesting is that Bohm continued to think about the storyline of aliens from space until he was in his late 60s. So I just find it interesting that this whole story that he ran into stayed with him for forever. But here's the things I want to point out. He had these fantasies of going out into outer space and to planets where the aliens were having trouble with the darkness and the light side. So the dark and the light were fighting. And he fights on the side, he's with the side of the light. And then he brings those back together in the formation of some resolution that brings wholeness, a new way of bringing harmony. That is kind of a storyline, is something that I also think shows up, particularly in dialogue, but it shows up in other ways as well. So what he's starting here, Chrissy, this is for you especially. What he's starting here is there's the dark side and the light side. And somehow those come together. So that's point number one, dark side, light side. They come back together and they start forming wholeness. So even here at this early age, he's starting to talk about wholeness and difference. Now this one, I put him because there's so much that is important about his later ties to Marxism. And I think this is where we see the early start of this. So he was in school and they were studying about freedom and equality as American ideals. And he said, I took that very seriously. And he goes on to talk about his orientation at that point. He thought that society owes the opportunity for people to advance regardless of their background. So that's the freedom and equality. But he says the individual was called on to stand on his own 2 feet. So the individual had to make something of this opportunity. So this is when he's like still in grade school, so to speak. But now what happens when he gets a little bit older, and particularly when he gets to Berkeley, he's lived through the Depression. He's on the verge of the Second World War and a lot of other things. So that what we start to see here then at the Berkeley age is his ideas start to shift. And that's where he starts being curious about Marxism and communism. And then again, as others have presented, his research on the plasma state really gives him a good metaphor for that idea of society needs to be providing a much heavier role than he had early thought. The individual still has responsibility. The weight is beginning to shift a bit and be more oriented towards the role of society. This is a fun one, the third and the fourth dimension. So he says he's about 10 years old here, and he's going to the library all the time. Well, he picked up a magazine that talked about something called the fourth dimension. So he's reasoning to himself. He says, well, humans, because we're so tied to our physical senses, we can't perceive the fourth dimension. But that's where the cosmos must be. The full whatever there is out there, it must exist in the fourth dimension. So he pictures it as a 4-dimensional sphere that has tube light structures that come out of it. And these tubes are all merged at the center. Now, each of these tubes is made up of atoms, but of course, we're made up of atoms. And so what that means is that everything in the cosmos joins at this center point of the four-dimensional sphere, and that's the source, but it's also the unification point. So that we see, here again, we're seeing the underlying unity that he starts to conceive of, that everything has a common source and everything is in one way part of the whole. Now, and to some degree, this is a way in which he starts to find a place for himself. So he doesn't have good places in his family. So he sees a place where he can actually fit into this overall picture of the cosmos. Well, here's another fun one. So he's at this point at Penn State, and he had been given the assignment of figuring out the mathematical formula that would define the movement of a gyroscope. So all the other students are out there working on the math, not Bohm. No. He goes about it entirely different. What he does is he spins himself or whatever until he, in his own body, gets the feeling of what it would like to be the gyroscope. So he wants to feel within himself whatever that energy pattern is and really get it in his physical sense. Then what he does, he goes out and writes the mathematical formula for what he was feeling inside. Well, guess what? He got the formula right. So here's an early pattern for him that began that he did throughout his life. And I've got some really beautiful examples of that, which I probably won't have time to go back to today. But he had also started his squabble with mathematicians because he said, the mathematicians they just want to, it's like they've got a food grinder and all they want to do is turn the handle and pump out all sorts of formulae. He says, no, you got to go inside and find the meaning inside yourself first, and then you do a formula. So the point is, get the meaning first and then do the mechanical stuff later. I think we'll see that a lot. This is one of the really, really important ones. And this was, for Bohm, truly a peak experience. So by now he's at Berkeley. And Oppenheimer, oh, and by the way, thanks to Maureen for letting me borrow this image. This isn't quite the situation that I'm going to describe, but you can see here Oppenheimer and you can see Bohm. So at least it's about the same age. So you can get a feel for what he looked like then. So Oppenheimer had asked Bohm to present his research results to the faculty and to his peer students. So he worked really, really hard on all the formulae and all the material he was going to present. So he says he came into that meeting with a high state of focus. But the interesting thing was when he started to present it, it seemed like the whole audience fell into a state of deep focus along with him. Now, this was really big for him. I mean, they fell into a state of light. He was seeing light in the room, and it's like they were all engulfed. Now, remember his fingers of light dream. This is starting to come up again. So here's how he described it. Now, given that I took this right out of something that he had, this was in a conversation he was having. So it's not edited, and all these are a little bulky in their language, but to me, that gives all the more poignancy to them. So here's how he describes that. Now, one of the points was that I felt that this was not only a world of light for me, but actually everybody was in it. That this was the essential point. There would be light that would be shared by everybody, bringing everybody together. Sounds kind of like the fourth dimensional sphere here. In other words, at the highest state of being would be one in which everybody would enter the world of light, so they would all be related, would form one. And in coming out of the shadows, they would all be united by this light. You see, a oneness, a wholeness. So truly, this is a peak experience for him that stayed with him throughout his envisioning of what groups could be, what it could be like. Now, he tells us how he interpreted this story. So he goes to Plato's cave, the story of Plato's cave. So if we were to look at this analogy he's giving us, us little humans would be down here where my cursor is on the screen, on this picture. So we're sitting down here in the shadows. And up on the wall, what we would see, and this is really about all we could see, would be these various shapes that kind of move around a bit. But from our viewpoint, this is reality. That's all we know. However, in back of this wall that we're leaning against are these three people. They're holding up rods with shapes on them. And then up here on the ledge is a fire. And it's the fire and these shapes that are creating reality here. You might say, if you're an American, you might say, oh, that's fake news up there. Well, there's something else here, though. So if you look over here, some of the people who are down there with us have figured out that they can get out of the cave. Well, what that means is they can come out into the sunshine and they begin to realize that reality is here, not here. But, and look, here's this one guy just about to get out of the cave, and he has to shield his eyes. He's never been in the sunshine before. He's shielding his eyes, and in fact, he wants to go back down and be here where he's comfortable. So he'd rather stay in the shadows. But Bohm says that during his presentation, he had entered the world of light and he hadn't been blinded by it. Wow. We'll come back to that one again in a minute too. Now back to the Fingers of Light story. When he was a child, he had had the desire to have what he called a super and intense light awareness. Now this is when he's still quite young. So this light would get so intense, it would become invisible, like ultraviolet and so on. He said, I remember even when I was 14 or 15, this notion of a super intense light could excite me tremendously, would really raise my blood pressure. So then, besides it being a super intense light, it went along with a super intense awareness. So he said, I felt the ordinary mode of awareness was rather foggy and weak. You know, that's home. But somehow there was another state of consciousness, which was not only mine, but which was common, which was the whole. So it belonged to everybody. So he said the sense of awareness was in contact with everybody with tremendous energy and clarity. Well, I'm going to stop for a minute. Here are the pictures I chose to illustrate quite a bit of this, a few that I sadly had to take out. But I want you to do what you did before. I would like for you to take a moment and put in the chat what is one word, a title, or a phrase that you think David Bohm would have used. You know, would have described his sense of this chunk of his life. And then I'm going to wait for a few moments, and then James, if you'd again share out some of the highlights. Okay, so I'm going to put this one back up as just a bit of a reminder for you. So what do you see, James?
Well, definitely a different vibe from last time. I can see there is another common thread, which is sort of came from your talk, which is the concept of light. So I can see words like enlightenment. I can see movement and light. Someone said a glimpse in the ineffable, but also words such as wholeness or potential energy or connectedness and transcendence.
Mm-hmm.
Someone also said that, seeking relational understanding,
Mm-hmm.
or connections or relationships and relations.
Very good. Right on, every one of you. So what did he say? I mean, luckily, he told us too. So let's see what he says. Ah, no surprise, a world of light. So we have a world of shadows, we have a world of light. So here's how he had described it. The world of darkness, the ordinary kind that was a bit dull and dead and foggy and weak. This is the world of society, the world of shadows. And then when he imagined having a super intense awareness, and in later life, he similarly experienced times of being in contact with others with tremendous energy and clarity, and he called that the world of light. So very interesting. Two phases of life, the world of shadows, the world of light. Well, what can we do with that? So I said we want to find pattern. So remember, I started out saying, what are the inner life patterns and meanings that guided David Bohm's experience and that are reflected in his life work and theories, in particular, his ideas about dialogue? So let's delve there a bit. And I suggest that the starting point for looking for pattern is going to be in this area right here in the middle in the red circle. So what is the relationship? What's going on between these two that might give us some hints? And I'm going to suggest there's some people who could actually help us with that. So let's see. Oops, I'm going the wrong direction. Okay. So this is what it looks like, the world of shadows, the world of light. Ah, Bohm really liked to talk about Heraclitus. Heraclitus was the 6th century pre-Socratic philosopher, and he was known for talking about the conflict between the opposing members of a pair being the ultimate condition of everything. Holy moly, Bohm's going to be in great shape here. He's got a good start on that one. Well, so Heraclitus, if he were speaking today, would say that we're stuck in either or thinking. Things are either this or that. However, he says we really need to think instead of both and. So nothing, Heraclitus would have said, is entirely this or that, but paradoxically, both. So that paradox, he said, is the very heart of reality. And the tension created by the opposition of the two members of the paradox generates the context for existence. Oh, that takes a bit of digestion there. Okay, somebody else. How about Carl Jung? Carl Jung loved Heraclitus. So to start with, in this red box, there are a couple of things from Jung. Every process is a phenomenon of energy, and all energy can only proceed through the tension of opposites. He says there is no energy unless there's a tension of opposites. So he says that both in a physical sense and in a psychic sense, we've got to have that kind of polarization that happens. He says energy is created by a whole being split into two poles, one positive, one negative, which creates tension and a flow of energy between the poles that can be harnessed as the fuel for work or the accomplishment of something we want. He took Heraclitus to heart, I think. So here's another thing from Heraclitus that Jung takes. It's called the enantiodromio. Now, those of you who are Jungians would already be aware of this one, but he says the enantiodromio is running contrary-wise, by which sooner or later everything runs into its opposite. So we don't just have these opposites sitting there static. They're going to run into each other and have a collision of some kind. Well, so here we got the world of shadows, the world of light, and swinging back and forth. Well, I got this point and I thought, yeah, that's an interesting idea. Can I actually find some evidence in David Bohm's life that makes it worthy of proceeding any further? So let's go back to his Berkeley seminar where he had used the analogy of Plato's cave. So afterwards he says, the experience I had at this seminar that went well, I had a feeling afterwards of being let down. I felt at that moment in giving that talk with that state of high energy, I had sort of entered the world of light. And then I sort of was sinking back into this world of shadows, and people were praising me for this talk. And that was like saying, well, I could now become a pillar of the physics establishment and cast a bigger shadow than some of the others. But it seemed insipid. So the whole thing began to depress me. And it took about a year to get over that, or maybe even more. So what he's seeing is, oh, I can go back here. Well, I'm not going to go here. I'm going to go over here. I'll be one of the shadow casters. No, I don't think so. So clearly here, he starts out with his peak experience, but then he ends up being depressed. And here's another example. From his story, you know that when he was at the latter stages of his Princeton stay, that he began working on the hidden variables theory, and that's this box over here is the front page of that article that he submitted. Well, this was big. This was going to be really big. He pictured that this was going to revolutionize physics. There are going to be all kinds of conversations and debates and discussions that would come out of it that would really set the future trend of physics. So he's in Brazil by this point in time, and he writes back to a friend in the US. He says, I can't believe that I should have been the one to see this. Well, we know the outcome. It didn't have the expected effect. In fact, his whole writing of that was treated with great indifference. And much like his coming home as a child, his father dismissing him. So he's dismissed. It's not paid attention to. And his heart is shredded by this. So here's what he says. Now he's talking about the indifference of the physics community here. He said, it cut at one's insides like a hot knife being twisted inside your heart. So here he's gone from, I can't believe that I should have been the one to see this, to it cut at one's insides like a hot knife being twisted inside your heart. Well, luckily for Bohm, there's another stage here. So this is Jung talking about the resolution. He says, although things are separated and polarized into psychic halves, they eventually are meant to come back together through a third reconciling symbol or power. Remember my talking about the skylark of space, and early on he's talking about the dark side and the light side, but they come back together in wholeness, and they're reformulated in a new way. The shuttling to and fro of arguments and affects represents the transcendent function of opposites. Now they together create a living third thing, not a logical thing. It's not an idea per se. It's a living third thing. It's a movement out of the suspension between opposites, a living birth that leads to a new level of being, a new situation. So there's hope. Well, who else talks like this? How about David Bohm? Now remember, up here in the corner, I put that the theorist puts his personal bias into his theories without even recognizing it. Bohm's not talking about himself when he says this, to his knowledge, but I think he is. What he's talking about and what I'll share with you here, he's talking about Hegel's dialectic. He says the polarity of fixed positions is that which brings about the conflict, as well as it brings the possibility to perceive how those factors in combination can lead to a new, not seen before direction. So paradoxically, he says, the conflict is the gateway to new opportunity. However, one has to be free enough to see it. Interesting. So he's talking about Hegel's dialectic. What does Hegel's dialectic say? The dialectic is made up of two opposing positions called a thesis and an antithesis. And though these two, the thesis and the antithesis, appear to be distinct and separate, in fact, they will tend to flow into each other, creating a third state or the synthesis. Now, I put this symbol here and a little note to myself to remember to say, in Shantina's presentation on Taoism, we've already seen this description. So this back and forth synthesizing force that we might call in English the sublation is the driver and the memory which causes the dialectic system to function. So Hegel actually even quoted Heraclitus, who said, all is flowing, interpreting this to mean that the dialectic process is the fundamental feature of all existence. Wow. So here we've got Heraclitus, Hegel, Jung, and Bohm sharing the same pattern. Well, I'm saying to myself, let's get a little evidence here. Can we really see this show up in Bohm's life? So I want to take you back again to his ending days in Princeton. And here's where my cursor is. This is where I'm sharing from. So this is David Bohm describing, or I'm sorry, David Peat describing this. He says, those last months at Princeton, from his arrest to his trial and final suspension, were a difficult period for Bohm. World of shadows. Only while he was doing physics could he lose himself and for a time forget his fear. He loses himself in the world of light, of his physics love, his capacity there, shadow light. In his capacity to lose himself in his physics, he completed the book Quantum Theory and worked quickly during 1951 to develop the theory of his hidden variable approach. New possibility. Thus, out of the world of light and the world of shadows emerged something new. Now, much later, he would have described this as a new concept is thus formed which contains both of the previous polar opposites, but it's yet independent of them and goes in a tangentially new direction altogether. Okay, one other example. So this is such a busy slide. Let me just tell you the story. So at this point, he's gone to Brazil. And as he gets to Brazil, he's really hopeful that the other theoretical physicists there who are with him and he could really do some good work together. And then over time, quite a few of them left and moved on to other places. And by that time, the United States consulate had taken away his passport, so he couldn't travel. He felt like there was a lot of chaos, both within his physics department, but also in the university. And he hated the heat. He hated the digestion. So, you know, it's this world of shadow happening again. Well, in the midst of that, something interesting happens. Mario Schoenberg, who was another theoretical physicist, had been absent for a while from the university, but he came back. So the interesting thing about Mario Schoenberg was that not only was he a theoretical physicist, a very capable one, but he was deeply immersed in the theory of Hegel. So although Bohm had a few brushes with Hegel and with Marxism and so on, he hadn't really deeply studied it until it was with Mario Schoenberg. And so it was from this relationship with Schoenberg that he really started to delve in. Now, about that same time, Bohm had been writing a series of articles, and his interest in these articles had actually started back in Princeton. He's really interested in the idea of causation. So within physics, the idea of cause and how that plays through. So he'd written a series of articles. He gave them to Schoenberg to review, and Schoenberg's response was, nah, you're in this either or kind of a state. You can't have causality without having the other half of the pole. It's got to be polarized. And so then David Bohm went back into his thinking, and he develops what he calls causality and chance, which then became the book he published a few years later called Causality and Chance in Modern Physics. Now, within that book, he brings about ideas that we've all heard, the idea of necessity and contingency. That came out of those his understanding of Hegel's ideas, or at least began to really develop from them. And even later, when he's talking with Maurice Wilkins, he says that there were really inklings that came from that of the implicate and the explicate. So this, again, he's the world of shadows, the world of light, and new immense possibilities that emerged for him. So does Bohm have a life pattern? Well, he may have more than one. There may be other things there, but I would suggest that this is the overall pattern that I feel I see. That there's the world of shadow, there's the world of light, there's new possibilities that come. I've only given you a couple. I would say that there are a bunch more. And to some degree, I think I need some physicists to help flesh that out. But I would suggest that we play with this a bit and say, at least as far as we can see right now, this appears to be Bohm's life pattern. The world of shadow, the world of light, letting those swirl around together some, and then creating from that some new possibilities that go further. So I look at it like this. This is a term I borrow from Sigmund Freud, repetition compulsion. What is that? Well, it's a psychological phenomenon in which a person repeats an event or its circumstances over and over again. This includes reenacting the event or putting oneself in situations where the event is likely to happen again. So once this pattern becomes embedded within him, I suggest that it happens over and over again. Now, the picture I chose to try to illustrate this is a synapse, a neuronal synapse. This neuron up here is releasing chemicals. The receptive neuron down here is programmed so that it only accepts chemicals of a certain nature. So whatever it is that gets released here, it's only going to go in if it fits the pattern. So what I'm saying is I think that this pattern acts in Bohm like a magnet. It calls things to it and it accepts things in when they truly fit that pattern and how we can make use of it. Here's another way of showing it. David Bohm loved to talk about tacit thought, the fact that so much thought is tacit. I think one of his tacit thoughts, one of his tacit sets of assumptions was this idea of the dialectic, this idea of the world of shadow, the world of light, and the new possibility, so that as he approached the world, he was very much more receptive than maybe some of us would have been, that he tended to see things in terms of it. And here's where I'm saying back to Storlow and Atwood, that his personal bias was infused unknowingly into his own theories. So I'm going to stop there just briefly and say, James, could we just maybe take a couple of questions, and then I'm going to boogie on, because I've still got more to share. We want to go back to dialogue after this. Just see if there are a couple people who have a comment or question or a gentle criticism. Even if it's not gentle, I'll take it. Okay.
Yes. Yeah, just let me know when you're ready to continue with your presentation.
I will do. So just two or three at most. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll just stop your screen sharing so I can see everyone.
Okay.
Yes, I can see Stephen already has a question for you.
Yeah, well, first I want to congratulate you on a splendid presentation. What drew my attention and what I feel a strong connection with is the idea of the dialectic and the fusion of opposites, and you bringing in Hegel and Taoism. I would just like to suggest that because this concept is so important to Bohm and to many of us, it would be helpful to bring that dialectic into sharper focus. And my way of doing this over the years was through topology.
Hmm.
And I've worked extensively with the Möbius strip and Klein bottle as a way of really fleshing out the dialectic. It becomes more tangible. It becomes clearer. It becomes easier to live and to embody by this process of fleshing it out. So I'm just adding that as a kind of slight suggestion for elaborating on the dialect.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree thoroughly with you, Steve. In fact, the first time I tried to work through my slides, it was a 3-hour presentation. so you can tell that I went back and I took a bunch out, but I did not do as you're talking about with the Klein bottle. And I think that's really a good suggestion. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. I can see Eddie already has his hand up too.
Beth, fascinating presentation. So much I would not have been aware of before. In particular, the aspect of light and what that meant in David's life. But actually, as well, it's interesting that apparently when David would be in dialogue, and if he was having, say, some insight or some new thing that was occurring inside him, he would have sometimes the experience of lightning shooting through his body, like as in thunder and lightning.
Oh.
And if he didn't share what was occurring inside him, he was in danger of being damaged by that lightning. But once he shared it, it was fine, you see. So that's what it was Peter Garrett, I'm sure, that told me that at one point. So anyway, it links to you. It links to you. Yeah.
I'd never heard that one. Thank you for that, Eddie. Yeah, great.
Thank you for contributing, Eddie. I can see Jean has her hand raised.
Okay.
Yes, into it. The question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I feel a very interesting clue that needs to be explored about this union of opposites. Was there in the Gospels Jesus talking about marriage and all that material about the garment, the feast, and then specifically in the Philip's Wisdom Gospel, where the sacrament of the bridal chamber is mentioned? That's a very interesting area to look at. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. And you know what, there's also a lot in the study of old alchemy that goes on here. So the Hieros Gamos, so a lot of that whole rich tradition, I think, fits right in here with it as well. Somebody else?
Jonah, do you have your hand up? Or is that just... Or I can see Gary. Gary has a question for you.
I think this idea of mediation between opposites is, is really a critical issue and is pervasive. And I think that I wonder whether you would comment on the idea of this being a dynamical process, that the idea of the processual is really critical, and that in order for these conflicts or these interactions to be worked through, basically resolving paradox into complementarity, one needs a temporal continuum. That is, one needs to have a time base that is continuous, a continuous flow that allows these interactions between polar opposites to get worked out or to be mediated dynamically.
Yeah, yeah. Clearly, it's a dynamic issue, and I'm going to go into that when we start on dialogue. It's clearly a dynamic issue. And it is temporal, but it's also, well, one of my dialogue groups and my dialogue buddies are here on the screen with us today. We often talk about jazz as a really good metaphor for dialogue, and I think of dialogue in general as being musical. So clearly there's that flow. Clearly it's spread out a bit temporally. And it's also really difficult to chop these phases apart. So they really flow into each other in a way that, in truth, I think are very inseparable. And I'll try to share a little bit more with you about that.
If I could just say, the beauty of jazz and musicality is that it also introduces the idea of novelty and improvisation, right? The idea of something new emerging into the process.
Absolutely. Yeah, you hit it. Yeah. Great. Okay, James, I'm going to suggest that we move on, and then we'll have a little bit of time after I talk about how this fits in with dialogue that we can go for some more comments and questions. Is that okay?
Of course. Yeah, no problem.
So the problem for me is I've got the slide on the screen, but do you? What do you?
No, because I took off the screen share so I could see everyone. But I mean, yeah, go ahead and put it back on.
Well, I can't get to the place where it says screen share is my momentary problem.
At the bottom of the screen?
Well, I'm just seeing the big, I must be on screen share even if you're not, and I'm not sure how to, well, hold on just a minute. Okay. So can I push screen share now and go back?
Of course, yes.
Do you see now a slide from me?
No, not yet.
Okay, I'm sorry. What do I do here?
Are you?
There you go. Okay. So now if my apologies for being such a dope. I see it. I see it. Okay.
Perfect.
Okay. So let's see. Okay. How about that? Does that work now? Can you see my screen now?
Yes, it works.
Okay, so I want to take now what we've worked on so far and say, how does that relate to David Bohm's ideas of dialogue? So I want to share with you then one more example. My computer's being slow here, so I'm not lost. Hold on just a second. It seems like it wants to be really pokey. There we go. Okay, I want to share one more example with you of what I think his life pattern is in action. So up here we have the world of light, the world of shadow, and here's an outcome, a new opportunity that comes up. So the world of light, this is about 1961, and these are Cyril Bohm's words as she's describing the first time David Bohm had heard Krishnamurti speak. She says, this man, Krishnamurti, was saying what David had been looking for in other fields. And after that first talk, Dave was, well, I'd never seen anything quite like that with him. He was burning to talk to this man. So here we see him creating again a world of light. Now this was happening when he was at Bristol, and he wasn't all together with his fit there. The other theorists weren't paying much attention to him. So here again, he finds Krishnamurti and World of Light happens. Now this next part is from David Moody's book, and it's also something that David shared with us last week. So here comes the World of Shadows. We know these two men had a really wonderful relationship for quite a long time, 20 some years. And at this point, it seems like there's something that's not working well in their relationship. So Krishnamurti had shared with some of his confidants that he felt like he was no longer able to discuss with Bohm as he had done previously. The details aren't entirely clear, but evidently Krishnamurti confronted Bohm and challenged him regarding the depth of his understanding. And David Moody goes on to say that that appeared to be quite distressing to David Bohm. So here we have this initial sense of excitement and, oh my gosh, just what he's looking for, years of work, and then a confrontation where it comes for David Bohm to be a world of shadows. Now, interesting, so this is spring of 1984, and I would love it if David Moody could share sometime with me when in the spring it happened, because my guess is it's probably right before this bubble happens. So in the spring of 1984, for whatever reason, David Bohm goes into psychotherapy for his being very distressed with something. And he's in psychotherapy with Patrick Damare. Well, one of the whole other studies I've done is in the impact of Patrick Damare and his major influence on what I consider to be the methodology of dialogue. I'm not going to go into that right now, except to say there was a whole lot that came out of this that prefigured David Bohm's ideas of dialogue. Well, secondly, in May of 1984, there was a conference that was held. It was a small group. And I'm not sure if Anna Factor was able to join us today, but she and Don Factor, along with Peter and Jenny Garrett, had invited a group of people. It seems to me there were maybe 20, 30 people involved. And they were going to meet in the town of Mickleton in the UK. And they had asked David Bohm to talk about some of his theories. This was a group of people really interested in finding a better way to put harmony in the world. Well, again, to make a long story short, the book that came, the transcript of that particular session is called Unfolding Meaning. And I would credit the inception of David Bohm's dialogue in terms of timing to that meeting. To me, this is the starting point. And along with what Bohm had been learning from Patrick Damare, along with what he had learned from Krishnamurti, I think all these things together are the inception point for what we think of as David Bohm's dialogue. So again, I would say, here's an example of the world of light, the world of shadows, and a major new possibility. So that I think this is what it looks like. Dialogue is one of those things that popped out here. Well, I'm going to go a step further, and I'm getting on real speculative territory here. But I'm going to say that not only did dialogue come out of this world of shadow and world of light, but I think dialogue itself embodies this same pattern. So in what goes forward, first of all, I'm linking it together with Hegel's theory, and if you're at all familiar. Now, I want to be clear. Bohm did not buy all of Hegel's theory. I think he really did buy into the dialectic. And so I'm just speaking here of the dialectic. But I hope you can see that the thesis and the antithesis are these two here that form the polar opposites. And the synthesis becomes the new possibility. So I'm putting these things all together, saying they're isomorphic. They all embody the same pattern. So Bohm's life pattern, Hegel's dialectic, this whole idea here of how thought works, and then the process of dialogue. Granted, I can be wrong here, but that's my hypothesis at the moment, is these all fit together. They all come out of the same origin of idea. So I want to look at that and see if we can make more sense of it. And I want to start here with giving you just a really broad metaphor of how I see the flow of dialogue work. I put this little note to myself up here. I was so pleased when Leroy Little Bear had used the same picture of the Milky Way. So I just cut and put a hum. We'll come back and talk about that again in a little bit. But and one reason why I chose this was because, as somebody else said, the swirl, the idea of the funneling, all this idea of the movement in a spiral was something that was really prominent in some of David Bohm's descriptions. So here's my big metaphor. We start out in dialogue with something being whole. Something happens that fragments that sense of wholeness, and our dialogue is coming together kind of in here to figure out what happened and what's the way forward. So we work at it through our dialogic process, and eventually, if we're effective, it comes down here to the essence of the issue. It's really to the core. And once we've come to the core, which Bohm said happens in the implicate, then what we do is we figure out how to make it apparent to us. We make it explicit, and we take that learning back to us so that that new learning becomes a part of the whole. So that's a really broad metaphor. Now, I want to, for those of you who might not have done much dialogue yet, I want to give you a really quick example of how this looks in a real dialogue. So many years ago, I was working with a large healthcare system. One of the facilities was a system that served elders, in particular, a long-term care facility. It had lots and lots of problems, but one of which was that they had a terrible absenteeism problem. So you could say, as we were starting into the dialogue I'll share with you, that fragmentation, one of many, was swirling around up here. It was the fragmentation of people not showing up for work. Everything that the human resources folks had done didn't work. So this absenteeism issue had gone on for years, and in fact, they were staffing at time and a half to keep enough nurses on the floor. So this one particular time when we were dialoguing, this group, one of the members came in. He was a maintenance guy. He was really distraught. He was emotionally very distraught. Enough so, it was a total showstopper. I mean, we couldn't go on. We couldn't ignore this. He was so distressed. And with a great deal of difficulty, he shared with us that a patient in that facility who had been a very deep, close friend of his for years had died the night before, and he had just found this out as he came into the room there. So, of course, he was very distraught. Well, so again, here's even a deeper fragmentation that's beginning. That was a very awkward, uncomfortable situation. We were just silent for a while. Nobody knew exactly what to do. And as I was looking around the room, I was thinking, you know, some people, especially the care staff members, had what I called soft eyes. They were really watching this guy who was suffering and trying to project empathy to him. And then there were some folks just wiggling in their chairs because it was so uncomfortable seeing somebody so close to tears and so emotional in a social situation. And then there were some administrators who were doing something else. I'd call it eye rolling. So as we're going down this spiral, we begin talking about it. First, there's the empathic responses, trying to make this guy feel better. And that spurred off a whole lot of conversation about others who really struggled when somebody died there and they'd been close to them or been their care staff member for a long time. So that swirled for a bit of time. Well, then there was an administrator guy who said something to this effect. He said, look, we shouldn't even be having this conversation. We're all healthcare workers in one way or another, and people die here. People come here to die. That's part of the job. So get over it, suck it up, and move on. Well, that really made somebody else real angry. And this woman said, you know, you just hit the taboo right on the head. The problem is we are humans. We do suffer when somebody dies, and we need to be able to grieve. Well, that was right down to the core. So the issue to me and the importance of that is how often when we stick at the rational level, clear out on the edge, even though there's fragmentation going on, all of our rational technique isn't going to get us to the core. We need something different. We need something that goes deep, down under the surface, and gets us right here to the core. And so that's, I think, the beauty of dialogue. And I think that's kind of a portrayal of this action in motion. So I want to be clear here. We're not going to talk in this next part the way that we usually talk about dialogue. Bohm liked to talk about the flow of meaning moving through. He's not talking about the individual comments. He's talking about the flow. And I was trying to describe to you in that previous little segment about how I wasn't trying to tell you every single comment, but I was trying to talk about how the energy shifted and how things moved and finally got to the core. So that's the way we're going to go about it right here. And his idea on the flow of thought was also something, not only from Hegel, but this is something he even pursued further with Krishnamurti. So this flow of thought. So what he said was that this process is going to have an inherent dynamic of its own. And so the question just a bit before, is it a dynamic process? Yes, there is an inherent dynamic that is within the process of dialogue, I would contend. So I'm going to walk you through that really quickly. Now again, I'm being speculative, but this is what I would suggest. So I'd say the first step is that there's this world of shadow and world of light, however we choose to call it. And in Bohm's words, here he's describing the dialectic again, but he said, by making the opposites work on each other, you'll come to a higher level of understanding. So that's the first piece of this jazz improvisation. And so secondly, there's this part that's in the middle here. What's essential is for the mind to move into the broad middle ground between extremes. What lies between is a new domain for creativity, which is qualitatively different from either of the extremes. So we'll go more into this in just a few moments. But so here's a middle ground where these two, in their dynamicness, are doing some moving and shaking and rethinking, reconfiguring in here. And finally, there is this new possibility that comes out. Something new emerges, which is not either of the prior extremes, but rather implies the occurrence of a fundamental revolutionary change within. So those are the three phases I would see of the dialogue process, the inherent dynamic that's there. So now I want to just share with you how I set this slide up, or these next few slides up, before you get into the content. Up here on each of the slides, you're going to see a red box, and there's all sorts of bullet points, which are experiences, specific vignettes, most of which I've shared with you already. But these are things from David Bohm's life. In the shortness of time we have, I'm not going to be able to go through each of them. But what I want you to get is whatever I'm sharing with you about this pattern of dialogue, we'll have a little box up here to indicate that it is actually rooted in David Bohm's life experience. And secondly, I've put what I call the inherent dynamic up here. And again, I'm not going to be able to go to it each time, but I want you to be able to visually check and see, am I sticking within this idea of the inherent dialectic? So those two corners will be on each slide. Now, I also just want to notice that I said I was so intrigued by the many overlaps in our various presentations. And Glenn, I just want to say thank you to you and to Leroy, because you set the stage for this so well. So this is beautiful. So very quickly, what I'm saying is that David Bohm thought that the original possibility, the original state of wholeness, comes from our First Nation predecessors and current people. So what he's saying is that the state of wholeness is represented by many of the indigenous populations of the world. That people would sit around the fire, they would talk without it, they didn't have agendas, they didn't show leadership, all were equal, people were free to say whatever they wanted. They talked till they felt done and they left with some kind of sense of what needed to happen next. So that really is the origin point. Now, Glenn, you also helped me out greatly here because you already did this. And your slide, your picture was a whole lot nicer than the one I found. But essentially what we're saying is something happens so that there's a sense of fragmentation of that wholeness. And that's really the call to dialogue, is that something's off track. So we'll just leave it very quickly there. But then we move into a phase, and I didn't have fancy words for it. I called it the noticing the it and spreading it out. Well, what's an it? Well, I would say that because David Bohm thought that the flow of meaning was what described dialogue, I think there's a potential meaning that wants to come up. Now, if you're in a work situation, quite often the it has already been prescribed. And in other situations, in some of the dialogues that Linda Eleanor, who's here with us, and I put together, we start with a question. But what I've almost always found is even if you start with a question, dialogue's going to go where it wants to go. It's not going to go where we try to force it to go. So there are different kinds of potential meetings that might show up. It might be something different or unusual than we'd expected. It might be that we have an assumption that's not being met, or might be a brewing storm, which I meant this to show. So there's a need to deal with the emotionality that's going on in the room. It could also be something very positive. I had a marvelous work at one point in time with a group that was highly successful and had no idea why they were. And their desire was to dialogue in order to kind of kick out the pattern that they were going through together so they could make sure they kept replicating it. It could also be that, like in my group of dialogue buddies who are with me today, we just like to figure out what is this process of thought. So let's just delve into and see if we can pull out of ourselves into our tacit assumptions how this process of thought works. So those are possible its, possible potential meetings that want to come up. But here's what Bohm says now, and he's talking about the spreading it out. So he says, the process of unfoldment spreads information out about, he says the other, I'm saying about the it, before our awareness so that we can further differentiate it. You make it explicit, you unfold it, and then you can take a look at it and see if it has any value to it to take it any further. So we're just kind of starting to look at what are the potentials that might come up here and where does the group energy tend to consolidate and become something that we can actually pursue. Now this next stage, Bohm and Peat called the bedrock position state. I have this second, but in truth, this may go on for a long, long time. So what's happening at this point is we kind of spread out assumptions, but most of us or some of us will notice that my assumptions aren't matching with your assumptions. So for one thing, what's happening here is we're constituting difference. So we're up here, it may be real hard, fast polarity, or it may just be more of a difference. And Sky was really helpful to me the last week or so, finding this quote about the similar differences, the different similarities, the difference that makes a difference. So we're kind of looking for the differences that make a difference up here. But some of them do get very oppositional. And by the way, Eddie, thank you. This also describes his face. Knowledge tends to get caught in grooves and compartments, which become rather rigid, and so hinders further perceptions. So again, it's the stuckness, the rigidity with which we hold our own perceptions. So when one of those of our own perceptions gets confronted, and it's a really deep personal one, it's very tied to our identity, then I was saying up here in this picture, there's going to be a lightning bolt that we feel. Something's not going to feel good about it. So here's what Peat and Bohm described this as. They said, people of goodwill are generally able to dialogue together, but in practice, this only goes so far. The sticking point arises when they reach what they believe to be bedrock positions that represent for them absolute values and absolute moral positions. So in other words, the oppositions. So if you do that, you can feel like you're being, if you feel like these are confronted, it's something very deep within your sense of identity. Now, I think this is also a really important point, because I would suggest that this is a place where a lot of dialogues stop. I think a lot of dialogues don't ever go to this far, to the new possibility. So for example, in a work situation, well, I gave the example of the nursing home I was working with. The administrator there was trying to tell people, we shouldn't be talking about this. Get on with it, suck it up. Well, there's a lot of suck it ups in organizational settings that stop the flow from going much further. There can also be individual issues that stop it from going further. So that sounds really disappointing or negative. I've seen an awful lot of group conversations that do stop here and still provide deep value. I think there's deep learning when we're sharing this information. And there are a lot of better decisions that can come out in a work organization or any organization, any group, even if it doesn't go quite all this far. So I don't want to be one to say, if it hasn't gotten here, there hasn't been value shared. Now, these next 3 steps, this is really the jazz. This is truly where the jazz is going to happen. And I'm sharing them one at a time, but I think they can happen all at once. They can happen in different order. So I don't want you to take this as being too linear. So David Peat and David Bohm talk about what they call holding the tension. I put in that feeling of burn, because sometimes it does just burn when some of those deeply held assumptions of ours get hit by somebody else. So here's how the 2 Davids describe this. It's letting the full intensity of the feelings and thoughts to be present without attempting to change them, lessen them, chase them away, or deny them. We just let them be what they are, and we feel it. So Steve, I would say to you, this is the feeling it so we can get a handle on it. So we've talked about this quite a bit in our dialogue group. It's the feeling it. Because if we don't feel it, then that emotionality that's there is going to continue, and it's going to be one of those stopping points, the rock slide that covers over the road. Well, another thing he sees, and now in some places he talks about this as proprioception, and you can see this related to the previous slide. But what he goes back to here is that example I gave you about how he figured out the math formula for the gyroscope. And there are some other examples he gives that I'm not going to have time to share with you today, but some really interesting examples of how he figures out major things by going on into himself and really feeling all the emotionality. Bohm says that our intellectual, emotional, chemical, muscular functions are all braided together. And if we just get the surface thought, we can't really get to the meaning. So he said to his mathematicians, if you can't feel the meaning of something inside of you, you can't really get the formula. You really can't get the meaning. So he's saying that again here. This he talks about usually as sustention, but in some of the writing I read, he also calls it softening up and cherishing. I just love that terminology. For one thing, it's different, but softening up and cherishing. So what he's saying is we don't have to give up our opinion, and nobody in a dialogue is going to ask you to change your mind. But what you do need to do is to set your own assumptions aside long enough, well enough, so that for one thing, you can see them, You can kind of play with them. You can put them out in front of you so you can deal with it. But on the other hand, you need to be able to feel into other people's assumptions as well. He used the example of Bohr and Einstein, who had a horrible squabble, and he's wishing that they had done it differently. He says they should have cherished each other's opinions. This approach of cherishing the other person's idea is important, to say, I will really listen to your idea tentatively and really try to go over it in my mind and try to see why you think that way and what attracts you to it. And actually, he says, I'm going to see if I can even do a better job than you in presenting it. So that's the depth to which he thinks we need to go into each other's assumptions, not to change ours, but to enhance our capacity to feel into the other person's world and into our own. Okay, well, having done that, I picked this picture. This is a NASA picture of the currents in the ocean around the globe. And I picked it because I really wanted to emphasize here that he's talking about the flow. He's not talking about caught in individual ideas or having to accept or agree or disagree. He's wanting us to see how this moved. And in the example I gave, I tried to show you very quickly that in the nursing home example, this has gone from absenteeism to a big emotional outburst for a member, to different feelings about it and expressions about it, but generally it swung down to the point where they hit the core issue. So I'm really looking at this flow here. And he says that it's more important that we're sharing our consciousness, sharing our mind, rather than the individual thoughts that we share, because that's what takes us into the flow. So he says that what results from that then is a sense of participatory consciousness. And remember again his Berkeley experience with the light. He wants everybody going into the same state of consciousness. And we do that when we're able to set our own stuff aside long enough to join that with the others. If we do that, what happens? Well, we create a communal sense of emptiness. It's an emptiness that is large enough that allows that it that's been developing, that potential meaning, that has some space where it might show up. Now, keep in mind, this is a flow. We don't create what's going to happen here. It's a flow. So what happens next is that we have to allow this something to emerge. Now, I thought it was dynamite when I've forgotten who it was that shared this first on, but the quantum cloud, if you're looking at Gormley's masterpiece here, you can see that in the center, there's something denser, but you can't make out what it is yet. You just know there's something there. And that's what's happening in this empty state. You got a feel of it, but you don't yet have the capacity to really focus it. But that happens next. And guess how it happens? A flash of insight. So it comes and it shows up on its own. I mean, it's revealing itself at this point. Now, I remember a particular dialogue I was in, and one of the guys who was this really left-brained attorney and not usually into this kind of collaborative stuff, was in the group. And we'd reached a real difficult spot. We'd had a long silence. And then he said, I have no idea why I'm going to say what I'm going to say. And then plop. It was just exactly what the group needed at that point. Well, that's kind of this all of a sudden perceiving with a flash of insight, but it's not necessarily something that I've made up. It comes through me and is shared out with the group. So guess what? That insight gives us then the opportunity to move into that new possibility. Now, I think Bohm got really speculative on this one, but here's what he says. If you've gotten to that core point, and this picture here, by the way, is a black hole and in the sky, so I thought it was kind of apropos. He says, by grasping the notion of something, you have really removed the division of subject and object. And if you've read Bohm, you know this idea of the observer and the observed is really critical in his thinking. So between you, it's the division is remove between you as the observer and it as the observed, the universal and the particular. So both are united in the higher order of the whole, and by contacting the essence, you participate in the universal flow. So this point at the core of that picture up here, you know, my little picture of the Milky Way here, that's where you hit the core. You hit the essence, the meaning of the it. The it displays itself and lets you be a participant with it. Now, I know that's a stretch for some of you. And so I leave it there as a stretch, but here's how he talks about it. So again, here he's really talking about dialogue again. He says, I'm suggesting that there's a possibility for a transformation of the nature of consciousness, and both individually and collectively, that can happen, and it depends on dialogue. So possibly it could make a change in the individual, but also a change in the relation to the cosmic. And I'm hoping that this is where Lee will pick up tomorrow. So a change in the in relation to the cosmic. Now he refers to it as communion or a koinonia, the root of which means to participate. And that means the idea of partaking of the whole and taking part in it. Not merely the whole group, he says, but the whole, with capital letters, the whole. So then what we see is that we've flown all the way through here. We've gone to the core, we've gone to the inner part, and we've found a new meaning. We explicate it and we take it back out. Now again, I'm thinking of Leroy Little Bear. And those of you, Glenn and Angelina, and I apologize if I didn't say your name quite right, and Leroy Little Bear, you know what I think? I think the reason why David Bohm and Leroy Little Bear hit it off the way they did and felt like they were one was that they embody the same pattern. That would be my hypothesis. So now I've flown you all the way around his early life, or his early childhood, his later childhood, early adulthood, a couple of philosophers, Heraclitus and Hegel, and I forgot to put Jung in here, down through dialogue, and I'm hoping that maybe we're close in here somewhere. That's my hope. But here are my tentative conclusions. I would say that David Bohm's life pattern appears to be deeply invested in that of the fundamental dialectic process. That's one thing. So where did David Bohm get it? His life circumstances and whatever else he came up with made him very amenable to this fundamental dialectic process. So with that pattern established within himself, he tended to reenact or to draw to himself this pattern of the world of shadow, world of light, that dynamic, did that over and over again. And then he was able to hold the tension of those so that many of his scientific theories and also his dialogue were the product of those. So then both his scientific theories and his dialogue represent a reaching toward the fundamental essence or notion of something in order that there is a participation in the universal flow or wholeness. So I think his intention was to take us right here and let us have that sense of participation. Speculative or not, I kind of like that. So knowing that I've taken way too much time, I don't know, James, if we have any time for any quick comments or questions, or if I'll leave it to you whether we can do that or whether we should now.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we can take maybe one or two questions just because we're a bit late now, but I do want to also give opportunity for questions. So maybe one or two, if that's okay with you?
Yeah, great.
Perfect. Yes,
May I see?
Speak? Oh,
I
yes.
have chat function.
Okay, yeah, sure.
I just want to give a deep appreciation to our speaker, to your wholeness in your presentation and your presence. I feel like we're witnessing the creation of a new culture. And I'm very happy to be participating with you in that. Our definition of intelligence in my people are deeply indigenous to the Americas. Our definition of intelligence is the relationship between heart and mind. And I believe that you have really brilliantly illustrated that today. And I thank you very much.
Intelligence on its own, in fact.
Oh,
You're gonna make me
I
cry.
totally agree.
Yes.
Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you. That was beautiful, Angelita. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
I can see John Out has a question for you.
Well, she said it really, didn't she? She did say it, what you wanted to say.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'd just like to add something regarding Hegel. In recent studies of Hegel, and by recent we say like the last 30 years, they are trying to reevaluate this concept of synthesis. So instead of his actual meaning from, if you translate it from German, it's actually wholeness. So you go from synthesis, antithesis, and then wholeness. So it's like it's more appropriate. And also the recent scholarship also points that it's not really triadic but circular, which is more in line with the symbols that we're seeing regarding Bohm. And also an amazing parallel is, for example, emptiness in Chinese Buddhism, in Taoism, in Wu, is actually the presence of being and non-being. So they don't define emptiness as nothingness. They define it as being and non-being together.
Yeah.
So when they're present, then there's this potential to emerge. There's this, the Greeks call it aletheia. Coming out to truth from the ground of being that's hiding here in terms. So yeah, basically that's just like, I would just like to share that.
Thank you. Thank you. Great.
Thank you for that. Are you happy to take one more question, Beth?
Sure.
I saw. Oh, go ahead. Oh, no, I saw Glenn had a question for you, Glenn Pari.
It's not a question. I just want to echo Angelita in saying thank you so much, Beth. This was just so beautiful because you bring your whole being to the presentation. You're loving, you're caring, your compassion, your heart, and it does. It makes one want to cry because I feel I haven't integrated all that you've said, but it's a great depth that you're bringing, and it's the kindest and most inspirational presentation of David Bohm's work I have ever heard. So I'm just so moved. So thank you.
Thank you for that, Glenn. I think Paul has a question for you as well, or a contribution. Paul Howard.
Beth, I just want to echo the previous speakers. I think that your presentation was totally outstanding. I think it's got to be #1, I think, on all the presentations so far. I just think your passion, your enthusiasm for what you're talking about is just truly magnificent. And I just want to say that I will actually be adding a part to the documentary on dialogue, and I really want you in there. And I will be at some point updating the earlier part of the film in relation to Bohm's relationship with his parents, because given our time constraints, we couldn't spend huge time on it. So that whole world of shadows, I want to get into. But I just want to thank you so much for your outstanding presentation. It was truly magnificent.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Paul, for that. I'm afraid, yeah, I do have to close soon. Is there anything you would like to say just to close, Beth?
Well, you all just touched my hearts. I'm so appreciative of your being here with me, being patient with my having talked too long, and giving me the courage to take it further. I'd really love it if any of you want to talk further. I'm in the Sutra software, our program here, so you can share with me there. And if any of you want my email, then the Pari folks have my permission to share it with you, so you can keep in touch with me if you have something more to say. So my deep thank you to all of you. And I have to say too, David Peat was a very big part of this. And so David Peat, wherever you are, I only have one more chapter after this in my book that you asked me so many times, when are you going to be done with this book? So thank you, David Peat.
Oh, thank you. Thank you really so much, Beth. Thank you for being part of our series, and thank you for that presentation. It was like, you definitely put it was emotional, as in you put 100% your emotion into it, and it definitely, we all saw that. So really, thank you for that. And thank you all for joining us, all you participants. Before we go, I'd just like to make a couple of announcements. First of all, I'd like to invite you all for next week's sessions. So on Saturday, we will have a session with our good friend, Dave Schrum.
Tomorrow.
Yeah. Oh yes, sorry. Right. I was way ahead of myself. Well, tomorrow we have Lee Nicol, who will be giving a presentation on Beyond Dialogue. So I invite you all to that one. Next week we have our good friend Dave Schrum, who will give a talk called Beyond the Known Dimension, a journey into David Bohm's implicate order. And on Sunday, we will have Jan Wajcek, where he will talk about non-locality, interconnectedness, and the quantum observer. These are the last official sessions of the series, so I welcome all to join us. Now, I say official because we, together with Beth Macy, have organized a very special event to close this series. With this series, we've covered the past, David Bohm's life, his work, and ideas. Now we would like to conclude the summer school by looking into the future. On Sunday, September the 6th, we will have a closing session entitled Moving Forward with David Bohm, made up of a panel of some of the presenters from this series. The confirmed panelists so far are Leroy Littlebear, Lee Nicol, Shantina Sabadini, and David Schrum. And Beth Macy will be our facilitator. The session will be free to anyone who has participated in this series. Personally, I am very excited about this, so I strongly recommend all of you to join us. I would also like to remind everyone about Sutra, as Beth mentioned before, which is our discussion forum for the website. With this, we will be able to keep the discussion going from these sessions, explore related topics, ask questions, and clarify some points made in the presentations by talking between the participants and speakers. If you haven't received your invitation for Sutra, just let us know by contacting us. Now, last week I did stay a bit longer to basically show you guys how Sutra works, and I have heard people that couldn't be there if they could have a recording. So I will make sure that that will be available this week for you. I think that's it for announcements, but if you have any questions, whether it's about Sutra or any queries of any nature, you can contact us by visiting our website on the Contact Us section, or you can just send us an email with these email addresses, james@paricenter.com for me, and eleanor@paricenter.com for Eleanor. Thank you all again for joining us, and we'll see you again soon here at the Pari Center.